Am I going too fast through these, or
No. Right,
Shall I go on to Davidson then?
Yes, Davidson is the one person you mentioned that you haven't taken up.
Now, Davidson, incidentally, is remarkably influential in England, and indeed, I would say more influential in England than he is in his home country. But with perhaps a very good reason. He's certainly a very powerful philosopher. Davidson argues that there is a more intimate connection between meaning and truth than previous philosophers have been aware of, or at least have made explicit, and that is this. If we wanted a theory of meaning for a language, the way to get that theory of meaning would be to get a set of principles which would enable us to deduce for any sentence of the language under what conditions it was true. So that for Davidson, a theory of truth really is a theory of meaning. There isn't any gulf between meaning and truth there, in that once we've got a theory that makes clear what are the truth conditions of sentences, that is already a theory of meaning of the sentences of the language.
Well, I don't think we'll go any further into the work of each of these individuals, Professor Searle. I think we ought to move on now to the second of the main lines of development that you mentioned, and that is the line of development that's concerned with the intentions of speech users. Now, the central notion here is the notion of a speech act, isn't it? Which is indeed the title of your famous book. The idea is that that sentences don't just kind of exist in limbo. They don't exist all by themselves, autonomously in the universe. They are generated by human beings, and they are always generated in actual situations, and they're always generated for a purpose, in order to do something. And the idea is, isn't it, that you can only understand meaning if you understand the intentions of the language user. What is he doing when he utters something? Would you take it up?
Yes, well, let
there?
me go on with that. In the tradition that we're now talking about, it isn't that there is a rejection of the question, what is the relation between language and the world? Rather, that question is put in a larger context. The question now becomes, well, what sort of behavior is linguistic behavior? And then the way that that is answered is in such a fashion as to try to explain how the speaker's intentions, how his rule-governed intentional behavior relates language to the world. So the question, how does language relate to reality, which I think is one of the fundamental questions, perhaps the fundamental question in the philosophy of language, is assimilated to what I think is the larger question, and that is, what is it about human beings that enables them to, as you said earlier, make these noises that have such remarkable consequences? Among them is the consequence that they do relate to reality. Look, for me, in this tradition, the fundamental question is, how is it that we get from the noises that come out of my mouth to all these semantic properties that we attribute them? I mean, after all, from a physical point of view, the noises that come out of my mouth are fairly trivial stuff. I mean, my jaw flaps open, and I make this racket, and out it comes. And in linguistics textbooks, there's all this ridiculous stuff in my throat and mouth that enables me to do that. But physically, it's all rather trivial. And yet the most remarkable things occur. We say that chap made a statement or asked a question or gave a command or an order or an explanation, that what he said was true or false or interesting or boring or uninteresting. I mean, we attribute all these remarkable properties to it, and one set of those properties are those that relate it to the world. Now, the basic idea behind this second approach is that the way that language relates to the world is a matter of how people do that relating. And the basic term of that, at least in the tradition as I see it, is, as you said, the notion of a speech act. When people do communicate with each other, whether in words or in writing, they perform a series of acts that we have names for, such as making statements, asking questions, giving orders, commands, apologies. Austin, incidentally, claimed that he could get a list of about 1,000 such verbs and verb phrases in English. Now, that is the alternative tradition, and I should say Wittgenstein's enormously important role in developing that, the later Wittgenstein. And it would be misleading if I said that he would agree with everything that I have said. And I think there's a basic point of disagreement. Wittgenstein, though he was really the person who gave this direction to the philosophy of language, the idea of looking at language as a form of human behavior and language as a form of life. Nonetheless, he resisted making general theories of language. He thought any kind of general theorizing was almost bound to lead to distortion and falsehood when we were doing philosophy. So though I regard myself as, at least in part, inspired by the work of Wittgenstein, I think he would reject the theoretical bent that I personally try to pursue and that Austin, I think, was pursuing.
I was going to say, the other really big figure in this tradition, apart from Wittgenstein, the later Wittgenstein, is J.L. Austin, now, alas, dead. He died rather young, an Oxford philosopher. And indeed, you were a pupil of,
yes, I was indeed,
of Austin's,
yes.
weren't you? Can you say just he invented the term speech act?
He didn't quite invent the term. It did exist in certain structural linguists, such as Bloomfield in the 1930s, but in its modern meaning, it is Austin's invention, and he arrived at it by quite an interesting route. Before Austin, the primary concern of philosophers of language had been with those utterances that are true or false. And indeed, as I was saying earlier, verification loomed large, and there were such questions as whether or not propositions that weren't verifiable could even be said to be meaningful, the logical positivists arguing that they couldn't. Now, Austin made an interesting observation. He observed that there are lots of utterances that don't set out to be true or false. He gave the following example. He said, in a wedding ceremony, and when the preacher says, "Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" and the chap who says, "I do," according to Austin, is not describing a marriage ceremony. He's indulging in one. That is, his utterance isn't meant to be a description, true or false, of anything. He's performing an action. And Austin then observed a whole class of these utterances. When I say, "I promise," or "I bet," or "I apologize," or "thanks," or "I congratulate you," these he called performatives. And he then made a distinction between these cases where saying something is doing something, where uttering these phrases, these ritual phrases, is doing something. And he contrasted these so-called performatives with what he called constatives, those utterances that did set out to be true or false. But then the theory underwent an interesting sea change. He discovered that he couldn't make the distinction between performative really quite precise. The constative class was supposed to be sayings, and the performative class was supposed to be doings. But what he discovered is that, of course, that saying is a kind of doing as well. And that then led to his what he called the general theory of speech acts, where all of our utterances are seen as speech acts. And in my own work, I have come to the conclusion that the basic unit of meaning, if I may so speak, is the speech act. That what we are looking for when we ask such things as, what did he mean by that, is precisely into those intentions with which his utterance was performed. That is to say, what kind of speech act was he performing? Statement, question, command, and so on. And then within the speech act, we'll need to distinguish between the kind of speech act it is, whether or not it's a statement or a question or an order, and on the one hand, and what its content is. I can both predict that you will leave the room and order you to leave the room, or ask whether you will leave the room. Now, in some sense, I want to say all of those have the same content, though they have what Austin called different force. And he had a label for this. He called those illocutionary acts, that is, the basic speech acts where we're saying something and saying it as a statement or question or command, as contrasted with those of our utterances that we can describe in terms of the effects they produce on people, whether or not I convince you or amuse you or bore you or annoy you, those he called perlocutionary acts. Now, I think that bit of his taxonomy enables us to see that our quarry here, the target of our investigation, is the illocutionary act, that large class that includes making statements, asking questions, giving commands, apologies, thanks, congratulations, and so on. And there, it seems to me, if we investigate those, and here Austin unfortunately didn't live long enough really to do this investigation, but I've been working on it and other people have tried to work on it. And there the crucial question is, what is the structure of the illocutionary act? And that is that's the form, and I think this is a derivative from Austin, that is the form in which the question I was asking earlier has really come to take shape. And that is, if we ask that what I said was the question, how do we get from the physics to the semantics, that then is translated into the question, how do we get from the utterance to the illocutionary act? So I think you can see a line of development there from Austin. But again, I want to emphasize that Wittgenstein wasn't like that. He did inspire much of this, but he would have thought that to do it in this theoretical way was almost invariably, almost bound to distort the immense complexity and subtlety of language.
Now, you yourself have, as it were, taken up this work of Austin's, and you're developing it further. It's already several years since your book Speech Acts was produced. What are you working on now?
Well, I'm trying to carry this investigation into the next stage.